All right, going on, chapter 14. Sticky notes, page 371. Know this figure and caption about phthalates, which tons of it are in our cosmetics and toys. Soft toys especially and cosmetics have phthalates in them, which you need to, so if you wear cosmetics, you got to be careful about what you buy. And that stinks because our regulatory agencies don't seem to care. They say, oh, there's no problems, and a lot of people disagree with that. So when you buy makeup, it's really important to kind of read the labels and go on to websites. There's one called ewg.org, and you can click on their cosmetic search and find out how toxic the products you use are. Someday when you have babies, make sure that you buy phthalate-free toys for them, and they have it on the packages. All right, some other terms to know is acute versus chronic exposure. So an acute is an immediate exposure which causes an immediate problem, and a chronic exposure means small doses over time which build up and cause a problem. Know also what a synergistic effect is. So basically two chemicals that are safe by themselves, when combined, can cause a problem. On page 372, know the definition of global distillation. So really what this means is that because of the way our ocean and atmospheric currents work, and it explains it here, but you don't have to know like the whole method, but what you need to know is that chemicals are concentrated at the North Pole because of atmospheric and oceanic currents. And so around the Arctic Circle, we have huge doses of even banned chemicals that just won't go away, like DDT and PCB. And so the Inuit people that hunt for seals and walruses and eat that, they're full of those chemicals. And so are your polar bears and your walruses and things like that. And this process is called global distillation. Okay, you need to know from this paragraph here that fish and frogs are indicator species for pollution and why. Basically, living in the water, they can absorb it through their skin and their indicators. So if your fish and frog disappear from a river or a stream or a lake, then you need to examine what's going on. And worldwide, we have a serious decline in amphibians. A POP is something that's not in your book, but you need to know it. It stands for persistent organic pollutant. So basically, it's one that sticks around for a long time because it doesn't degrade, it doesn't dissolve in water, and it can go long distances. And so these would be the ones that are up here in the Arctic Circle through global distillation. Some examples are PCB and DDT. On the next page, on 374, know the definition of bioaccumulation. So basically, toxins accumulate in the tissues, mainly the fat cells in a species, and then they become more concentrated up the food chain, which we call biomagnification. So as they are stored in fat cells, we call that a bioaccumulation, but as you go up the food chain, you're going to concentrate them in higher and higher doses because they don't get flushed out of their body. They get concentrated and stored in the fat cells. And so if you have DDT in the water, or even in your zooplankton, or even in your small fish, 0.5 parts per million is not a big deal. But once you get up here to the osprey, and then the body, and the blood is 25 parts per million, then we're going to have some issues. And so some toxins are broken down, but it's also toxic. So DDT will break down, it'll degrade into DDE, but DDE is also toxic. So in this bird, you might have DDT and DDE. So what does DDT do? Well, it makes the shells weak in top predatory birds. And so when they sit on their eggs, the eggs break and the baby birds die. So the main species that this caused trouble in is bald eagles, osprey, brown pelican, and the peregrine falcon. Since we have banned DDT, these numbers have gone up. The bald eagle's recovering. It's taken off the endangered species list. It's now considered threatened. Ospreys are coming back. Peregrine falcons are coming back. And so it's been a success story. It's still not perfect, but it's a success story. So this process also occurs in the ocean with our top predatory fish with mercury. So mercury occurs when we burn coal, which has mercury in it. It goes into the atmosphere, and then rain brings it down into rivers and streams and then into the ocean. And in the ocean, it works its way up the food chain through biomagnification into our top predatory fish, so our tuna and swordfish, which have high levels of mercury. So the advice is you're really not supposed to have more than 1 or 2 cans of tuna a week, and pregnant women especially should have less. So these scientists have some famous case studies, some famous work. Louis Gillette, he examined alligators and how chemicals in the ponds were affecting their reproductive system. And Tyrone Hayes examined frogs and found that a lot of them were hermaphrodites, so they had both male and female parts because of the chemicals in their waterways. And these are both famous case stories that you need to know, Tyrone Hayes and Louis Gillette. All right, so let's talk about LD50. So, in a normal toxin, so not an endocrine disruption, but a normal toxin, whether it's lead or nicotine or bleach or whatever it is, the higher the dose, the higher the deaths, okay? And at some point when you kill 50% of the test population, whether it's mice or rats or whatever it is, we call that LD50. So at this dose, half your test population dies. So we call this lethal dose, 50% dead. So we also have ED50, which is the effective dose. So it might not kill you, but you're affected with some sort of a problem, whether it's you lose your hair or the mice do, or causes cancer or reproductive issues. That would be the effective dose. And the lethal dose, it would be LD50. So a dose response curve is basically the line. You can see it labeled here. Some toxins have a threshold. So the threshold is the point where there's no more resistance to the toxin, and then deaths start to occur. So the threshold is this point, so no effect, the body has no effect, and then we have deaths begin with dose. And then we can say 50% die here at this dose. So the higher the LD50, it means low toxicity. It takes more of it to kill you. But if you have a low LD50, it means that it's really toxic. It takes a lot of it, or I'm sorry, it takes just a little bit of it to kill you. So it's very, very toxic. So know these two things. High LD50, low toxicity. Low LD50 means high toxicity. All right, so how do we study toxins? We can study them in a couple of different ways. We can do a lab study with mice. But we can't study humans ethically, obviously, but we can look to where there has been exposure. And so they did this in the Yaqui Valley in Mexico and found out that kids in the valley were exposed to agricultural chemicals and pesticides, and kids in the foothills were not. And so these are 4-year-old, the differences. And so we call this an epidemiological study. What's going on with the brains of kids who are exposed to chemicals through no scientific study. They just were exposed, and then we can study kind of after the fact. Page 380. So let's talk about risk and risk management. We know these chemicals are an issue. So we study risk assessment and risk management. Okay, so maybe there's a chemical, a shower cleaner, that's going to kill 1 out of every 10 million people using the shower cleaner. Should we take it off the market for 1 out of a 10 million risk or not? And so we have risk assessment to help us understand truly what things are really risky. And so you do need to understand the death rates of things. What really causes the most deaths? 1 in 98 people die from motor vehicle accidents versus dying in an airplane. So people are scared of flying but not scared of driving, and this is illogical. Earthquakes don't kill very many people. Lightning doesn't kill very many people, but guns do, poisoning does, suicide does, stroke, cancer. Even a terrorist attack is very, very low rate. We put so much money in preventing terrorism, which we should. Don't think I'm not saying that we shouldn't. But we really should be more scared of the cheeseburger because that's more likely to kill us. So human beings in general, you and I, we are not always rational with our fears of what kinds of things, the probability of dying from certain things. Okay, so on this page, know what risk assessment is. That means assessing what are the risks of certain diseases, certain activities, certain chemicals and toxins. How do we manage that risk? What is an acceptable risk? The EPA's acceptable risk is 1 in 1 million. So they will allow a chemical if it causes a problem in only 1 out of 1 million people. You need to know what these are, the Centers for Disease Control, and what they do. What does the FDA do, the Food and Drug Administration? And what does the EPA do, the Environmental Protection Agency? A lot of kids, I just have these here and they're like, oh, CDC, FDA, EPA. Really understand what these do. Study it. It's important. Okay, 382. We have 2 approaches to product testing. In the US, we do this approach. Preliminary testing, we put it on the shelf. If we find out it's harming some people, we recall it. Europe does it this way. Extensive testing. They do what's called the precautionary principle. Extensive testing, they find out there's some problem. They never put it on the market, and then and this has to do with laws. So the United States laws for products are less stringent than Europe. All right, page 383, know this law, which is FIFRA. What it does is it regulates pesticides for safety. The EPA administers the law. So it stands for fungicide, insecticide, etc., but everyone calls it FIFRA, so you're fine with just knowing FIFRA. Know what OSHA is, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Basically, it's a government organization that regulates workplace safety. Know what TSCA is, Toxic Substances Control Act. The law requires the EPA to monitor industrial chemicals. That's a test question. It's not just all chemicals, it's industrial chemicals. Know what the Stockholm Convention is? It was in 2003. It's an international treaty that banned the Dirty Dozen, which were the 12 worst chemicals. And this included PCB, DDT, and dioxin. And these are the 3 most famous of the 12. And so they're banned for most of the world, banned and signed the treaty. But they're still persistent in the in the world, because they don't break down very easily. So the old ones are still around. And then we have REACH, R-E-A-C-H in Europe. Know how it differs from the US and how they treat chemicals differently. And that's the end for chapter 14.